15 minutes of question and answers. You can type the question and answers throughout the presentation using the chat box. And if you face any difficulties, you can also use the chat box to let us know and we will figure out what's wrong. The webinar is being recorded and the recording would be available in a few days. And now I'm going to give a quick introduction to Jennifer. Jennifer is a water resource engineer working on low impact development and green infrastructure and stormwater management. She mainly works on site and in community development, implementing stormwater management strategies. And she has over 15 years of experience in low impact development and green infrastructure, and has her expertise in drafting bylaws, standards and specifications and drawings on stormwater green infrastructure. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about some practical advice on green infrastructure for the 21st century. I'm going to go through some of the steps of what a successful program looks like, go into kind of what the context in Moncton currently is, and then I'm going to talk about some successful programs from across Canada, particularly in Vancouver, Edmonton, and Kitchener. So what are some of the steps that we need to put into place for a good low impact development or green infrastructure program? One of the first things you do need to do is to review your bylaws. You need to make sure that there's no clauses that contradict or prohibit LID, as well as making sure that your bylaws allow for stormwater on private lots or allow for stormwater crossover lots if that's how you want to set it up. You also have to look at what facilities are acceptable to each municipality. The types of facilities you choose may depend on your rain distribution, what types of soils you have, and really what you want your program to look like. If you're in a very urban area, you could have a lot of underground facilities that don't take up a lot of room, whereas if you're in a more rural area, you might want a lot of at-surface facilities and more of the garden look. You want to consult your stakeholders. This is really important to include your city departments in, especially your maintenance and operations department, or whomever is going to be looking after these. There's some fairly simple changes you can make to how you design facilities, depending on what your existing infrastructure and existing maintenance programs look like. So you definitely want to engage your ops guys to make sure that they're going to be able to keep up and maintain your facilities. You're going to need to consider what your drivers are. Your drivers might include water quality, nutrient removal. It might be volume capture or a stream health metric. How we design the LIDs or how we set up the program will depend on what those drivers are. You need to decide what your review and approvals process is going to be. These facilities are very multidisciplinary types of things, so you're going to need a lot of coordination between your different municipal departments, your landscape architects, your engineers, your geotech, hydrology. All of those departments are going to have a say on how the review and approvals process should be done. Next thing is having design standards and standard drawings, always helpful for those of us who are trying to get them into the ground. This can include setbacks on lots, what your preferred drain times are, and that depends again on what your rain distributions are. How you want your inlets and pre-treatment and outlets to look like, as well as other issues that can come into play. And then maintenance. It's really important to lay out very clearly who is responsible for the maintenance of these facilities. It might be your parks department, it might be the engineering department, but it's important to have a manual in place that really lays out whose responsibility is, what you're doing at what times of the year, and how frequently they need to be maintained. One of the biggest questions that we run into is putting these on private property. when a facility is on private property, generally the private owner is responsible for the operation and maintenance of the LID, which is good for a municipality in terms of they don't have to maintain it, but is bad in terms of whether it gets maintained or not. There is an issue of removal of facilities, especially on single family residential. You know, someone comes in and puts a pool in and suddenly your rock trench is gone. You can use bylaws or restrictive covenants to ensure that the facilities are remained and are maintained. You can also look at something like a public utility program, wherein people are charged for stormwater, and having those facilities gives them a credit. So if it's removed, the benefit of having it and having that credit is also removed. And then whether or not you want to accept private water. So the right-of-way and public land can be used for regional facilities. This puts it firmly into the municipality's control, but you are accepting water from private properties at that point. So where are we with Moncton? Well, currently they're focused on flood mitigation or rate, as opposed to water quality or water quantity, which is volume. You have a net zero policy on stormwater flows, and I believe that's from the 2-year to the 100-year plus 20%. There are some LIDs being used in some of the newer residential builds, and climate change is a big concern. You have participated in a climate adaptation study, and you're concerned both of peak flows and sea level rise. The precipitation also tends to be peaky, and using more of a Chicago storm distribution. So let's look at some of the successful programs across Canada. So in Vancouver, they're really quite far ahead in terms of having the policies and standard documents. This graphic shows kind of the regulatory context for Vancouver. You have your federal regulations, and then there's a regional regulation that then goes down to the municipalities. Vancouver in particular doesn't have to worry about the fishery acts as much, as they only have one intact non-piped stream in the city. It's the last wild salmon stream in the city, and it's a really small portion of the city. The province does require a integrated liquid waste and resource plan. And in this case, Metro Vancouver took the lead and created that plan for the entire Lower Mainland. Under that liquid waste management plan, every urban creek is required to have an integrated stormwater management plan or an integrated rainwater management plan. The city, having very few creeks, has created a citywide integrated rainwater management plan that came into effect in 2017. Now, the rainfall in Vancouver tends to be very slow and moderate, and it mostly happens in winter, and they have mostly poorly drained soils. So those things directly impact what type of LIDs that they use. So the integrated stormwater management plan covered the drivers or visioning for the watershed, the bylaw review, and it has extensive stakeholder consultation built in. So just by doing the integrated stormwater management process, our first few points on what we need to do to set up a program are checked off. Now, the goals of the ISMP include supporting nature's ecosystems, preparing for climate change and severe weather, protecting sensitive water bodies, and reducing combined sewer overflows. Now, because they are a pipe system, technically, they're only concerned about water quality, but they're also about 25 years into a 75-year combined sewer separation program. So they are infiltrating water and removing volume from the system in order to offset predicted climate change increases that would affect the storm system. So they're trying to build that resiliency into the storm system for climate change. They're also trying to protect their recreational water quality. Some of the areas that are very popular for paddling and recreation are severely impacted in water quality. And they do have some beach closures every year. So the city's rainwater target is for 70% of the rainfall. They want to infiltrate it. So soak it up, capture it. That equates to about 24 millimeters a day. For the next 20% of the annual rainfall, they want to treat it. So they're treating a total of 48 millimeters. And then the remaining 10% of annual rainfall is your larger storms, your 2-year or more storms. So for that 10%, they want to convey it safely and provide adequate service to their neighborhoods. Now, as I said before, Vancouver has a lot of really good standards and guidance. Metro Vancouver took the lead and produced several documents, including a template for integrated stormwater management planning, as well as the stormwater source control design guidelines. Now, the design guidelines are pretty good in Vancouver, and they include all the different types of accepted LID measures, as well as sizing graphs, which is really helpful. And they actually have several graphs for each practice, depending on the amount of rainfall, all the way from 1,000 millimeters up to 2,000 plus millimeters. They have typical drawings, they have advice on siting and soils, and they also have example calculations for every type of practice that they have. So BC has taken the approach of getting all the guidance and all the regulatory framework in place, but the municipal bylaws are still trailing that integrated stormwater management process. So bylaws around development, stormwater, and land use are now being amended to include the ISMPs and source controls. Source controls are also considered a tool to assist with climate change adaptation. And as I said, Vancouver is using source controls to help build a more resilient stormwater system. So what are some of the barriers that Vancouver ran into? Well, first was Vancouver is a very large city, and there's quite a bit of politics between the various city departments. So there's quite a bit of conflict between various city departments about how they were going to go about these programs and what the goals and targets were going to be. Internal processes are not in place for approving and inspecting source controls. So even if you're going to go out and put these on your lot, there's a chance that the city reviewer won't have a high familiarity with the measures. There's still discussion about maintenance responsibilities and costs, whether that's going to be borne by the private landowners, if there's a regional facility who is responsible for that, and then also what budget is going to come back to out of that. That goes back to that kind of interdepartment conflict. Everyone has their own budget, and you know, stormwater can't start putting demands on maintenance's budget. There are liability concerns, mainly due to water, drinking water. So the barriers coming from the public health department, each region in BC has a health unit, and currently the one in Vancouver has concerns about placing LID facilities over water mains, which I think Vancouver is the only place I have ever heard that concern come up. So there is a bit of a barrier in putting these into the public space right now, because most places where we have boulevards and stuff like that, we have water mains. So right now Vancouver's having a problem in that it has great documentation, a great regulatory framework, and they just can't get them into the ground. Operation and maintenance of private and homeowner modification of private source controls still remains a concern. There's no really good regulatory way to enforce what is essentially public infrastructure on a private property. So the next program we're going to look at is Edmonton's Rain Garden in a Box. This was a particular project under the city's overall environmental strategy, and green infrastructure has been identified in the River for Life implementation plan for the city of Edmonton, which is a 30-year strategic plan supporting the city's mission to prevent pollution. The city has also just approved a large budget to start looking at putting 20,000 LID facilities into city rights-of-ways over the next 20 years. And the city actually has implemented LID in several developments and on several city projects. This program was a pilot project for do-it-yourself facilities, and it was designed for single-family residential lots only. So the initial desire was to infiltrate 25 millimeters and to reduce phosphorus inputs to the Saskatchewan River. Now, the soils in Edmonton are generally poor. There are some areas with sand, and they wanted to use a local source of materials for these rain gardens. So after looking at all the different various challenges on the project, we looked at reducing the target to 15 millimeters or setting an impervious to pervious ratio to 10. Now that's impervious to pervious ratio is a measure of how much impervious surface is going to each facility. So a bylaw review was required to ensure that the rain gardens would be in compliance. We had to review the drainage bylaws, design and construction standards, lot grading and grading guidelines. And then we had to talk to the legal department. Make sure you consult with your legal department. They keep them in the loop, and they have some really good advice when you're trying to put these programs into play, and they've seen a lot of things that you might not necessarily think about. So to comply with bylaws, certain design constraints were applied to the rain gardens. So one of the bylaws is owners are required to maintain approved lot grading as approved during construction. So our solution there was that we maintained lot grading as much as possible without changing the high points or the low points. So overall, the lot still discharged and drained to the same points that it did previously. There's also a bylaw that all new detached, semi-detached duplex units are required to be connected to the storm sewer. And when they say that, they mean that the roof leaders and roof drainage requires a direct connection to the storm sewer. So owners with a separate storm service were allowed to get a seasonal exemption or a deferral letter to temporarily disconnect their roof leaders during the summer season. So from approximately May to October, they were allowed to disconnect, but then they were required to reconnect their roof leaders over winter. Level of service requirements stipulated that you needed you could have less than 350 millimeters of ponding in the 100-year design storm. So the solution to that was limiting our ponding to 300 mils. And then later, as we worked through the process, we actually eliminated the ponding in the rain gardens altogether. Going through this bylaw review might raise other issues. So in this particular case, it raised the permits and permissions issue. Was the city going to require permits? Were they going to inspect them? What was going to be done on the verification side? The other issue it raised is that most properties in Edmonton share a side swale. There's a swale between both properties that brings water down towards the street or towards the back of the property, depending on which way it drains. To put a rain garden in this shared swale would have required an easement agreement between owners. Now, we did have legal draft up a document that was something along the lines of 20 pages. And we decided that it was just going to be easier for the city to say that you weren't allowed to put a rain garden in a shared swale rather than trying to administer the program with these needs for easement agreements and maintaining that and having that follow the home down through ownership. So the stakeholder consultation was pretty extensive here. It was done through online surveys. Interestingly, no one saw any real barriers to this. But one of the things that came out of it is they didn't want engineering drawings. So the original project was going to be to provide design standards to the city in the form of engineering drawings. And everyone kind of settled on wanting more of a comprehensive how-to guide. They also didn't want to require the homeowner to get a permit. The whole purpose of this was to encourage people to put these in themselves. And they thought that getting a permit might slow that down or perhaps convince some people not to do it. They did support registration of the rain gardens by the city. They set that up as an easy web registration. You could just sign in, fill out a few things, and it would just send the form to the city. And they also agreed that some kind of inspection or verification of the rain gardens was needed. So what that verification process eventually ended up looking at, is that the city decided to offer mentors if wanted to rain garden owners. These mentors came from their master gardening program, and you could request a mentor through an online form in the same place where you could register your rain garden. The mentors could assist with the design and build methods, and they could also give you kind of a step-by-step, this is what you need to do, this is who you need to talk to type thing. Currently, the verification process is voluntary, as it is registration, but that's going to be evaluated once the program's better established. So as more people do this and more people put them in, they might switch over actually to just a photo verification, or having those master naturalists go around every so often to verify the rain gardens. So the guide is intended to walk the homeowner through the process of installing a rain garden. It has a very simple lot assessment process. You assess your soils with a very simple infiltration test. Teaches you how to measure your slopes, as well as determining where you can put a rain garden or where you shouldn't. And it has a checklist to help homeowners move through the planning, assessment, design, and building process. So the next program I'd like to talk about is the City of Kitchener. That's the city that I live in work in currently. And currently in Ontario, there are no LID guidelines at a provincial level. They are drafting those guidelines. They're expected to be released soon. They've kind of been expected for 6 years now, so soon is a relative measurement. Once these guidelines come in, the municipalities will all need to implement policies to allow for LID on all developments, including their own municipal projects, including their road projects. So it's going to be a very big change once they come in. Ontario is looking at a 90th percentile rainfall target. For Toronto, that's about 27, 28 millimeters. Here in Kitchener-Waterloo, it ranges between 28 and 30 millimeters. So even though we don't have standards, many municipalities already require what we call a water balance approach. The region of Waterloo and Guelph especially, and that's an approach that requires you to match your existing infiltration levels to in your development. So you have to offset the development and infiltrate water. This is mainly due to the fact that these regions are groundwater supplied regions for drinking water. And the idea that we want to be replenishing our aquifers in order to maintain our drinking water supply. Several municipalities also moved ahead with additional infiltration targets. So Toronto has 5 millimeters, the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority has 5 millimeters, Credit Valley Conservation has 3 to 5 millimeters, the Lake Simcoe Regional Conservation Authority required 25 millimeters, as well as having a phosphorus removal target. And then the City of Kitchener requires 12.5 millimeters. So the City of Kitchener did go through an integrated stormwater management master plan process. That's where their infiltration plan was laid out. So their drivers, their bylaw review, and their stakeholder consultation all occurred in that master plan process. This is really a stopgap until the Ontario guidelines are released. It doesn't meet the full Ontario guidance, or what will be the Ontario guidance once it comes out, but it is a larger target than a lot of other areas are using. So we're required to infiltrate 12.5 millimeters, and that target comes from stormwater modeling, and that's the volume of water that needs to be removed to avoid having to update storm pipes in a climate change scenario. So again, we're using that volume reduction to make a more resilient stormwater system and to address climate change. And we have to treat 27.5 millimeters, which is the full Ontario target. Interestingly, our infiltration here is based off of regional source protection plans, and that's our groundwater source protection. So depending on where you are in the city, you may be able to infiltrate more or less types of surfaces. The current interpretation of the infiltration policy does look at each target separately on a per catchment basis for impervious area only. So you don't have to infiltrate off of lawns, provided that those lawns don't proceed to flow over parking lots or roadways. This map shows our source protection planning. We have various wellhead protection areas as well as issue contributing zones. Our issue contributing areas are for either chlorides or nitrogen in this area. And depending on where you are in the city, you may be able to infiltrate everything up to your roads, or you may only be able to infiltrate your roofs. The City of Kitchener does have an implementation plan, and it actually does a really good job in laying out exactly how infiltration should be considered. So it breaks it up into your, if you're inside an issue contributing area or a wellhead protection area with a vulnerability score greater than 8, there's very few things that you can infiltrate. And then it steps down to eventually, if you're outside an ICA and outside a wellhead protection zone, then you can infiltrate almost everything. So we do have some guidance documents in Ontario. In some ways, Ontario went the exact opposite way of Vancouver. We don't have the guidance and we don't have the provincial documents, but we're putting them into the ground all over the place. So our main guidance document comes from the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority and the Credit Valley Conservation. It's a document, it has some sizing and design suggestions. Most of the sizing is non-dynamic sizing, so it doesn't account for evapotranspiration or infiltration over time, as well as some best practices in terms of maximum slopes, depths of soils, and things like that. Each municipality must develop their own standards and guidance. So there's no one standard design drawing. Every municipality is going to have to address that once the guidance comes out. The Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program, or STEP, is a regional program run by all the conservation authorities, and they've taken a really big lead role in implementing these in Ontario. They've done pilot projects, they have monitoring, they have sizing spreadsheets and costing spreadsheets. And they've also converted the guideline, our CVC TRCA guideline, into a wiki document. It's online and it's constantly being updated with new data and new practices as they run their monitoring programs. So for example, there was a very strict soil specification for amended soil in the guide, and the wiki has kind of expanded on that and provided a more performance-based specification for the amended soils. So they're taking their lessons learned and putting it into the guidance through the wiki. So what were our barriers? Again, conflicts between various city departments. This is the reason you really, really want to consult with your city departments as you're moving through. One of the biggest ones is between stormwater and transportation, because in the city they are required to put these facilities within the right-of-way on all transportation projects. So there is a bit of a back and forth there. One of the other issues is there is a bit of a constant reinterpretation of how the new infiltration policy is applied. Every 6 to 8 months or so, as they're working through projects, it kind of changes how they're looking at it. That's kind of inevitable, because these programs aren't static programs, and as you work through different projects and come up with different surprising constraints, that program is going to have to be flexible and grow with the projects. Maintenance responsibility and cost. Again, it comes down to who's looking after these. Is parks responsible? Is stormwater responsible? One good thing that they did do is that the City of Kitchener has a stormwater utility. So the maintenance responsibility and cost for private corporations is offset by a credit on your stormwater utility. So if a private corporation has an LID facility on their lot, they just have to register it with the city, and they can get up to 40% off their stormwater fees, which could be significant for a larger lot. It's less significant for a single family homeowner, but they still get the same 40% discount. One of the big things is that the city wants what they call unencumbered parks. And basically what that means is they don't want an LID facility in the park for a private development. This is starting to get a little more difficult as we get into redevelopment, because a lot of the times these redevelopment towers, and generally we're building towers now on redevelopment, are zero lot line projects, which means they have underground parking from lot line to lot line. Not a lot of things you can do to offset infiltration when you have 3 stories of underground parking, and often we have to look at regional facilities. But the city does not want those regional facilities within dedicated parkland. The source protection can also be very limited. There is a cash in lieu option for the city. So for every hectare that you cannot treat and or infiltrate, there is an option to pay the city. It's not an inexpensive cash on lieu, but it can help you in those areas where you just can't put water into the ground. And unfortunately in the city, there is frequently high groundwater. You do want a separation between the facilities and groundwater. General rule of thumb is about 1 meter. There's a lot of places where we have to actually insulate the facilities because we can't put them deep enough to get below the frost line without running into the groundwater. So high groundwater can make these facilities a very difficult thing, and we have a lot of that in Ontario. So to summarize, we are putting these in right across the country, from Vancouver all the way out to the East Coast. We are putting these facilities in. Having a well-designed or a well-thought-out program makes it a lot easier for these facilities to be put in correctly, in a way that they're going to be maintained and to continue to function to meet your goals. These can be used for climate change adaptation. They can be used for water quality. They can be used to reduce erosion in rivers through volume control. And any of these facilities can be used for one of those or all 3 of them at the same time, depending on how you design for them. It's really important to get your entire municipality on board. It helps to have a champion, someone who's willing to go out there and really drive these forward. And don't forget about your operation and maintenance people. They have good suggestions about how you can design these to be better operated. better maintained, and how to fit them into existing maintenance programs that you may already have. If there is any questions, I am willing to take them.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box. Oh, we have a question from James. He's asking, in the case of Toronto, Ontario, how will the Don Mouth naturalization project affect stormwater management in the city? And what would that mean for the city's low impact development, green infrastructure going forward?
So the Don Mouth naturalization project, in a way, could be considered low impact development or green infrastructure. It is a river restoration that's going to actually include some created wetland areas that will help with treatment of stormwater on the port redevelopment. The biggest issue in the Don Mouth naturalization is that the port lands do have some contaminated soils. And I know they're looking at some areas to look at doing phytoremediation, which isn't quite green infrastructure, but it is an interesting practice that's becoming more and more used. So they're looking at phytoremediation for some of the more contaminated soils.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
I was going to say, in Toronto, their wet weather program is actually going to be a much bigger impact on the stormwater management. They have a wet weather and basement flooding program that's actually putting LID in a variety of areas in the city to try to help with some of the basement flooding issues.
Jolene says, thank you so much, very interesting. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions. So that makes us come to the end of this webinar. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for the amazing presentation. And thank you so much to all of you for attending the webinar and for questions. And I'm pretty sure if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can email you, Jennifer.
Of course.
And we have recorded the webinar, so the webinar recording and the presentation slides would be available in the next week for everyone who registers. So thank you so much.